Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. June 7th, 1968. Mekong Delta, South Vietnam. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the mangroves still dripped like they were sweating. In a small clearing cut into the brush, a Viet Cong battalion commander stood with his hands behind his back and tried not to let his men see the anger in his face. 14 bodies, laid out on woven mats, boots still on, rifles still slung. 14 of his fighters, gone in the span of 3 hours. No craters from artillery, no scorch marks from airstrikes, no helicopter rotors chopping the sky, no American battalion pushing through the paddies, just silence, and the kind of death that arrives without warning and leaves without footprints. His radio operator stepped forward with a sheet of damp paper. It had been intercepted from a South Vietnamese militia post downriver. A quick field report passed hand to hand before it ever reached the headquarters. The commander read it once, then again. 6 Americans. That was the number the report kept repeating, as if the writer didn't trust it either. 6 men had slipped 4 kilometers behind his line. 6 men had found the forward outpost his scouts swore was hidden. 6 men had neutralized the sentries, destroyed 2 ammunition caches, and vanished back into the green maze before a single reinforcement element could seal the route. His mind did what commanders' minds always do after a shock. It searched for precedent. He had fought Marines in the ruins of Hue and learned what it meant to be crushed by momentum. He had lived through B-52 strikes where the earth rose in waves and trees fell like matchsticks. He had ambushed American platoons at night and watched them panic in the dark. But this was something else. This was not weight of fire. It was not mass. It was precision. It was humiliation. And it made his skin prickle, not from fear of dying. He had made his peace with that years ago, but from something worse. Fear of being hunted. He looked up at the faces around him, hardened men, veterans of years in the swamps and rice fields, fighters who could move barefoot through thorn and mud without a sound. They avoided his eyes. One of them, a young squad leader with a fresh bandage on his arm, whispered the word that had been spreading like fungus through units along the rivers. Mat Zan. Green faces. The commander hated superstition. He hated rumors. He hated anything that turned disciplined men into children, but he could not ignore what was happening. In Saigon, American advisors talked about special warfare like it was a doctrine. In Hanoi, intelligence officers talked about it like it was a disease. By the summer of 1968, a question burned in every Viet Cong headquarters across the southern provinces, spoken quietly, never in front of political officers, never written in reports. It was no longer if you would encounter the green-faced men, it was whether you would survive when you did. The first stories had started 2 years earlier in early 1966, along the Rung Sat Special Zone, the mangrove swamp south of Saigon where the rivers split into 100 veins and the mud could swallow a man up to his waist. Back then, no one called them seals. That name hadn't yet taken root in the Vietnamese language. They were simply ghosts. Fishermen found their sampans split open and drifting, the cargo missing, the rope ties cut clean as if by a razor. Viet Cong tax collectors disappeared on the return walk from villages. Sentries on riverbanks were found at dawn with their weapons untouched, eyes open, faces turned toward the black water like they had seen something rising out of it. Local cadres sent reports up the chain. At first, the higher commanders dismissed them. Americans did not fight like this. Americans traveled in noise and numbers. Americans arrived with helicopters and flares, with artillery that shook the ground and loudspeakers that promised surrender. Americans fought in daylight. These new Americans broke every pattern the guerrillas had learned to exploit, and that, more than any body count, was the danger. Senior Chief Petty Officer Daniel Rourke understood patterns the way other men understood prayer. Rourke had the calm eyes of someone who had stopped expecting luck to save him. He had spent months before his first deployment studying Viet Cong field manuals translated by intelligence officers, memorizing how they posted sentries, how they moved supplies, what they believed about American habits. He carried those beliefs in his head like a map, because if you knew what an enemy assumed, you knew where they were blind. On the night of March 2nd, 1966, he led a 7-man element through black water toward a staging area near a bend in the Soi Rap River. They moved chest deep, slow, letting the swamp hold them like a secret. Their faces were painted green and charcoal, not for intimidation, not for legend. Simply because under broken moonlight, the human face is the first thing the eye recognizes. Each man carried a rifle sealed against water, a knife that could open a crate as easily as it could cut rope, and a small amount of explosives wrapped in oiled cloth. Rourke carried something else, a hand-drawn diagram of a tunnel spur system captured 3 weeks earlier. Taken from a village meeting site where no shot had been fired, where the only evidence of American presence was a missing satchel and a faint indentation in wet grass. That night established the template. They would not march like infantry. They would appear, strike, and be gone before the enemy's brain caught up to its own alarm. 6 to 14 men, darkness, unlikely terrain, swift violence, faster disappearance, hours, not days, and results that made conventional metrics feel almost childish. In the first months of these operations, American commanders who had spent years reacting to ambushes began to realize they had acquired a weapon that did not merely kill, it changed behavior. Lieutenant Commander Peter Mallory watched the early reports from a small operations center near Na Bay and understood the deeper significance. These teams weren't winning firefights, they were attacking the psychological foundation of guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla war depends on initiative, choosing when to fight, where to fight, and disappearing afterward into terrain and population. The green-faced men reversed the equation. They hunted the hunters. On April 11, 1966, Mallory coordinated a series of raids on supply caches scattered through the Delta. 3 separate targets struck inside a tight time window. Rice stores went up in controlled flashes. Ammunition pits became useless. Communications gear disappeared. A political officer who had lectured villagers at dusk did not return to his hammock at dawn. The Viet Cong response revealed confusion more clearly than any interrogation. They rushed reinforcements to areas the raiders had already abandoned. They increased sentries on trails that were never used. They spread rumors among their own troops. Americans who could breathe underwater. Americans who could see in the dark. Americans who walked through mud without sinking. Fear, when it spreads, does not require facts. It only requires repetition. The effectiveness of these teams came from training that was less a course and more a filter. Not everyone could live this way. Every man had survived a brutal pipeline that pushed bodies past comfort and minds past quitting. They had trained in water until water felt like a home that could also kill you. They had learned to move as a group without talking. They had learned the difference between bravery and impatience, because impatience got you spotted, and being spotted got your teammates killed. But the real advantage was conceptual. They trained to think like guerrillas, then arrived with capabilities guerrillas did not have. They learned how to navigate without light, how to read vegetation for signs of recent movement, how to disappear in plain sight, how to stay still for hours until the moment became inevitable. In May 1966, Petty Officer Michael Sato, quiet, almost gentle in the way he handled equipment, spent 4 days watching a Viet Cong battalion logistics node from inside a reed-choked canal, no wider than a hallway. The Viet Cong never knew he existed. They didn't know their security had been penetrated until a series of coordinated strikes hit the exact point Sato had marked. Not a random hammer blow, but a surgeon's cut. By late 1966, captured documents revealed new standing orders circulated among local units. Avoid contact with small American elements operating at night. Assume any patrol under 15 men could be green faces. Do not pursue Americans into water or deep mangroves. If uncertain, withdraw. Those were not the orders of an army eager for confrontation. They were the orders of an army that had learned some encounters were simply not worth the cost. In the Delta, engagement distances were short, often less than 50 meters. At those ranges, training mattered more than numbers. A small team could generate a density of fire and movement that made larger formations feel clumsy. And when contact began on the team's terms, it ended quickly. But numbers alone did not explain the hatred. Rourke recognized this during a briefing in July 1966 when intelligence officers slid a translated propaganda leaflet across the table. It described the green-faced Americans as devils. It warned villagers that painted men brought curses. Rourke understood propaganda. Everyone did. But he also recognized the genuine fear beneath it. For years, the Viet Cong had owned the night. Darkness was their sanctuary, their shield, their advantage. Now something else was moving in it, something that did not stumble, something that did not panic, something that arrived silently and left proof behind. The price of that advantage became clear on August 19, 1966, near a tributary close to the Cambodian border. A team led by Sato walked toward a target that looked too easy. A small supply element exposed, lightly guarded, almost careless. It was bait. Sato recognized it late, the way the brush had been disturbed, the way the sentries were positioned to observe approaches rather than truly defend the stores. But recognition does not always grant escape. The team fought its way out through dense vegetation and rising gunfire that seemed to multiply with each minute. Their extraction came under pressure. One man took a round through muscle and kept moving. Another suffered shrapnel in his leg and refused a litter. They returned alive. The mission was called a tactical success in the formal language of after-action summaries, but the lesson was clear. The enemy was learning, not fast enough to win, but fast enough to try. And somewhere in the upper levels of the National Liberation Front, a decision formed, cold, practical, and desperate. If you cannot defeat an idea, you put a price on the men who embody it. By March 1968, the bounty was real. Colonel Tran Quang Bao sat inside a bunker headquarters west of Saigon, reading a directive with the careful attention of a man holding fire in his hands. The number was written plainly, $10,000 American for confirmed kills of Navy SEAL personnel. Bao understood what it meant without anyone explaining it. His superiors were offering more for one dead commando than most farmers would see in a decade. It was not just incentive, it was admission, fear given a price tag. That fear had grown steadily through 1967 as operations expanded across the Delta and the Rung Sat zone. Rourke's element alone had conducted dozens of missions that year. They destroyed caches, seized documents, and quietly removed key organizers who made village networks function. The pattern repeated across units, small teams, night insertions, terrain the Viet Cong considered safe, targets the Viet Cong believed were hidden, extraction before dawn. The cumulative effect wasn't measured in enemy bodies, it was measured in paralysis. Supply routes shifted to longer paths, local cadres stopped sleeping in villages, meetings moved deeper into swamp camps, recruitment slowed in districts where stories of green faces traveled faster than political lectures. Lieutenant Commander Mallory studied those effects in the way an engineer studies stress lines in a bridge. In areas where the teams operated regularly, Viet Cong contact rates dropped, not because the Viet Cong had been destroyed, but because they were avoiding a problem they could not solve. Mallory recognized it as a strategic victory more significant than any single raid. The enemy was surrendering initiative, not because they lacked weapons, because they lacked answers. But Colonel Bao wanted an answer, so did Sergeant Vu Juk Min, a field commander with a sharp mind and a habit of staring at maps like he could intimidate them into honesty. Min began collecting every report of greenface activity he could obtain: courier whispers, village rumors, intercepted transmissions. He found a pattern that bothered him: boldness. The teams inserted deep. They relied on speed and surprise rather than mass. That meant vulnerability if caught in open ground or pinned before extraction. Min proposed a countermeasure to Bao: use small units as bait, credible targets, attractive enough to draw a team in, then close with larger forces hidden in prepared positions. It was an old guerrilla tactic, adapted for an enemy that fought like a guerrilla with better tools. The first attempt came on September 9th, 1968, northwest of Saigon. Min positioned his battalion around a suspected cache site and deliberately left it lightly defended, hiding two platoons in overlapping fields with clear lines of fire. The intelligence was real, but it had been allowed to leak. That night, the American team came, and then, unexpectedly, they left. No shots, no explosions, no bodies. Min learned later that the American element leader, young, barely older than Min's own junior officers, had noticed the trap through small details: a fresh-cut branch, a sentry posted where experience said one would not be posted. They aborted and vanished. Min was furious. He tried again 3 weeks later, modifying the approach. This time, he used a genuine meeting as bait, allowing the Americans to succeed in their initial strike, then closing the net during the withdrawal. The engagement that followed became one of the longest sustained firefights any of those teams had experienced that year. Rourke's element, inserted to capture a district organizer, found themselves surrounded by enemy forces that seemed to materialize out of the jungle itself. Minutes stretched into an hour, then more. They called for support. They maneuvered under pressure. They conserved ammunition with the discipline of men who knew the math of survival. They reached an extraction point with enemy fighters close enough to be felt, not just heard. They extracted with wounded but alive. The operation was listed as success. The target was removed. Enemy casualties were recorded. But Rourke knew they had been fortunate. Min's strategy was working in the only way it could work, accepting heavy losses in exchange for a chance to eliminate an entire team. The bounty wasn't just propaganda, it was a commitment of resources to solving the problem through targeted violence. Across South Vietnam, commanders began doing the same thing: studying, preparing, hunting the hunters. Lieutenant Commander Mallory explained the principle to a group of newly arrived operators in early 1969. He drew a circle on a board, Viet Cong controlled area. He drew arrows pushing inward, conventional forces. Then he marked a single point appearing inside the circle. The difference, he said, between pushing and appearing is the difference between a fight the enemy can prepare for and a fight the enemy loses before it understands it has begun. Rourke didn't need the diagram. He had internalized it through 2 years of operations that tested every assumption. The Delta favored small, disciplined teams. Visibility collapsed under canopy and humidity. Sound distorted. Routes existed that were invisible to anyone who hadn't lived in them. A small element properly positioned could break a larger movement simply by controlling the first seconds of contact, those seconds when the human brain decides whether it is in control or not. Vu Juk Min learned that personally in February 1969 during what should have been routine canal transport. His men traveled in 3 sampans, weapons ready but confidence higher than their caution. They believed the area was theirs. The ambush came from both banks, sudden and impossible to locate. The first burst disabled the lead boat's control. The second shredded cargo. A third explosion turned water into white spray. Min survived by diving deep and swimming until his chest burned. At dawn, they returned and found wreckage and bodies, but no Americans. Later, he learned it had been a 6-man team. 6. And the message that settled into Viet Cong ranks wasn't, "We can defeat them." It was, "We can't even see them." By mid-1969, directives captured from provincial headquarters revealed a fighting force increasingly focused on avoidance. Withdraw if contact is suspected. Fire warning shots and retreat rather than engage. Do not pursue. Do not chase. Do not follow. Colonel Bao recognized the deeper threat. He hadn't lost thousands of men, not directly, but the indirect effects were devastating. Routes that took 2 days now took 5. Villages refused cooperation, terrified of becoming targets. Young recruits hesitated, fearing the green faces more than they feared discipline from their own cadres. Bao needed a victory. victory, not just to kill Americans, but to prove they could be killed. So he planned an operation near the Cambodian border for April 1970, using intelligence about a reconnaissance mission to place multiple companies in overlapping ambush zones. He committed hundreds of men, accepting casualties would be high, calculating that wiping out one team would justify any cost. The insertion occurred as predicted. His units moved into position, the trap began to close, and then, inevitably, the problem revealed itself. The Americans recognized the shape of the ambush before it fully sealed. They took high ground. They established interlocking fire. They called in support with the calm efficiency of men who had rehearsed disaster. Helicopter gunships arrived and turned approaches into danger corridors. Artillery impacted in pre-registered rings. The night, which was supposed to protect Bao's movements, became an enemy, because the Americans had optics and markers that made darkness less a veil and more a hunting ground. Bao committed reserves at midnight. They walked into fields of fire they couldn't even identify. By 0300, casualties had climbed beyond what discipline could hide. Units began to hesitate, then to pull back. Bao ordered withdrawal before dawn, leaving dead behind because retrieving them would have multiplied losses. At first light, the Americans extracted no confirmed losses. The official numbers meant little. What mattered was what every surviving Viet Cong fighter carried away in his chest. You could plan perfectly, you could commit mass, you could choose the ground, and still you could fail, because these men were simply better at this kind of war than anyone else in Vietnam. The bounty increased soon after, but fewer commanders were willing to attempt collection. Some fear cannot be bribed into courage. The American withdrawal began in earnest years later, transforming the war through Vietnamization. Operations continued, but tempo shifted. Missions became advisory. The green faces still appeared, but less often and sometimes as shadows behind South Vietnamese commandos rather than the leading edge. Rourke, older now, briefed younger men in mid-1972 on profiles that felt like a different war. Support, assist, train, guide. He understood the strategy. He did not like the reality. You cannot hand a culture over like you hand over a rifle. Procedures can be taught. Instinct cannot. Mallory, now more senior, read reports that showed Viet Cong activity increasing in places where pressure had eased. The enemy wasn't stupid. They recognized when the night grew quieter. Colonel Bao saw the same numbers and felt something like resentment, not victory. He had fought those teams long enough to respect what they were. Their reduced presence wasn't the result of Viet Cong triumph. It was politics. And politics does not care about battlefield logic. In December 1972, Sergeant Vu Duc Minh died in a brief firefight along a canal when his patrol encountered what looked like a small South Vietnamese unit and turned out to be something else. The fight lasted minutes. Minh fell before his men could move him. His death was not a turning point, it was a footnote. Another line on a list in a war already slipping out of the American public mind. Soon after, word traveled through Viet Cong channels that the bounty would not be renewed, not because the green faces were less feared, because the Americans were leaving regardless. The final combat operations involving those teams occurred in early 1973, executed with the same quiet efficiency that had defined them for years. A prisoner snatch, a clean extraction, minimal response. By then, everyone understood the ending. There would be no decisive final battle between ghosts and guerrillas. The war they had fought so effectively would fade into something else, shaped by forces larger than any team in the swamp. Legends, however, do not fade so easily. The green faces remained carved into Viet Cong institutional memory, told not as stories of defeat, because defeat implies a fair fight, but as stories of encounters survived, whispers around cooking fires, short sentences spoken carefully, a look over the shoulder before names were said aloud. Colonel Tran Quang Bao survived the war and, after 1975, worked in a military analysis division of the unified government. In 1984, he wrote an internal assessment of American special operations. It was not meant for public eyes, it was meant as a warning. Pages described tactics, yes, but more space was devoted to psychology, the way a small number of men altered behavior across entire districts. Bao's conclusion was direct. The most effective American units in the war were those who understood that guerrilla warfare is fundamentally about the mind, not the map. Senior Chief Daniel Rourke returned to the United States and left active duty within a year. He kept his medals in a box where they wouldn't start conversations he didn't want to have. He trained others in skills he rarely described in detail. He avoided interviews. When people asked what it had been like, he gave the simplest answer he could manage. It was quiet. Lieutenant Commander Peter Mallory retired later and wrote articles for military journals in the 1990s, trying to explain why tactical brilliance did not automatically translate into strategic victory. He argued that elite teams were a scalpel, powerful, precise, psychologically disruptive, but they could not substitute for political will or broad legitimacy. Numbers were offered in various forms: ratios, totals, charts that tried to make meaning out of a war that resisted neat measurement. But the legacy wasn't really numbers. It was the lesson written into doctrine on both sides. Small, highly trained teams can create effects far beyond their size, if used correctly, if sustained, if matched to the enemy's vulnerabilities and the terrain's truth. And the most enduring effects are often not the targets destroyed, but the enemy behavior changed. Decades after the war, former Viet Cong soldiers soldiers interviewed by researchers described the difference in plain language. Regular American units were dangerous because they had more men and more firepower. The green faces were dangerous because they thought like guerrillas, moved like guerrillas, yet fought with the speed and precision the guerrillas could not match. They didn't just take away safe routes, they took away the night, and in doing so they turned fear, an insurgent weapon, into a counterinsurgent tool, proving that in a war of shadows, the most powerful thing you can steal from an enemy is not territory, it's certainty. Because once certainty is gone, every mangrove route looks like a hiding place, every ripple in black water looks like movement, and every quiet night becomes a question that no commander can answer. Are we alone out here, or are they already watching?